Alrighty, everybody. Hello, and welcome to How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. This is John,
And this is Dan.
and we are here with another spicy episode, bringing to you this week the party game Uno. So, welcome to the episode, Uno Dos Tres. Oh, wait.
Yeah, that's actually Tres Dos Uno, but we'll forgive you this once, John. So before we get into any rules and strategy, as always, we're going to take you through the origins of the game of Uno. So, and by the way, this story is adapted from an article on howstuffworks.com, and we'll include that in the show notes. So Uno was adapted from the popular card game Crazy Eights in 1971 by Ohio barbershop owner Merle Robbins. Initially, he played with his family and friends. They loved it, and so they thought others might love it too, pulled together some money, printed some card games, which they sold from this barbershop and from some other local businesses. Eventually, Robbins sold the rights to a guy named Robert Tezak, who owned a funeral parlor, and the price was $50,000 for this card game. And later on, Tezak formed International Games to market this new game called Uno, and in the process, he became a multi-millionaire. International Games became a part of Mattel in 1992, and today Uno is played by millions and millions of people around the world. One of the most popular party card games around. So I guess I would say Tezak made it big on this one, but the inventor Merle Robbins also did pretty well here, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The game got handed from a barbershop owner to a funeral parlor owner, and then to all of America. So,
Well, the
and
world,
all the world.
actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, kind of a strange origin, but still interesting nonetheless. Yeah.
So when do you play Uno, Jono? When's your favorite time and place?
So most of my memories of Uno probably came from high school, towards the end of the year in school when teachers sort of stopped giving you work to do. There would be a lot of people in my classes that would break out Uno and start playing. They'd pool their desks together in these massive clumps of desks and just play Uno for all the class time they could get free. And yeah, that's like mainly when I've seen it played. I think I've played it a few times here and there with groups, but it really just brings back the high school close to summer vibes for me.
Good vibes indeed. Yeah, I think most of the time when I've played Uno, it's been in a family setting. So, over at relatives for New Year's, I guess over at our house for New Year's, when we've got a lot of people over, really any time when we've got a lot of people over, I think Uno's fair game, and it's always a hit. So what do you think makes Uno so popular, John?
Well, I think probably just the simplicity of it. I mean, you have all these cards, different colors, different numbers, but each card only has one color and one thing that it does, right? So you have it's super simple. Even the cards that do stuff just have one word, like reverse or skip. So super easy to pick up. Also just really fun because you're constantly interacting with all the people you're playing against because you have to kind of continue this chain of cards. Has that really satisfying feeling of winning when everyone else has a ton of cards in their hand. And also the really satisfying feeling of watching your friend draw cards turn after turn. So I think it kind of hits all the right notes for a game, really.
Yeah, definitely. I think the simplicity, which you pointed out, I think the colors are also a non-trivial part of it. I think there's probably a reason why many more people play Uno than Crazy Eights these days. Just much more colorful game. I think the vindictive element can be really fun. Very social game. So yeah, making your friend draw 2 or 4 is always nice, or skip their turn too. And yeah, you can play over and over again. Gameplay's pretty quick. A lot of randomness involved, so you get a lot of different winners in a given sitting. So yeah, lots of elements for a fun party game.
Yeah, well, I mean, the games can be quick until they're not, and then sometimes they can go on forever. That's kind of what I remember playing some super long games where everyone's got a ton of cards in their hand. But
Oh man.
most of the time, yeah, it should wrap up in 15 to 20 minutes or something. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we've gone through sort of an introduction to Uno and its origins and what makes it fun, we're going to enter into our Rules Blitz segment now. So let's get to it.
Yeah, and so if you already remember how to play the game, feel free to skip ahead. But if you just want a quick refresher on how a game of Uno goes, then feel free to listen in. Alrighty, welcome to Rules Blitz, where we talk about the rules really, really fast. Today we're doing Uno. Go ahead and start us off, Dan.
Uno is a party game designed for 2 or more players.
The object of the game is to rid your hand of all cards. The first person with 0 cards left in their hand wins the round.
The game features 76 number cards, 24 action cards, and 8 wild cards for a total of 108 cards.
The number cards feature 8 of each number from 1 to 9 and 4 0 cards.
The action cards feature 8 skips, 8 reverses, and 8 draw twos.
Number and action cards are split evenly between 4 colors, red, green, blue, and yellow, for a total of 25 cards of each color.
The wild cards feature 4 standard wilds and 4 wild draw 4s.
Before the game, each player is dealt 7 cards. The remainder of the cards are placed face down in a pile. This is the draw pile.
At the start of the game, the top card is drawn from the draw pile and placed face up next to the pile. This card is now the discard pile.
Play normally starts with the player left of the dealer and proceeds clockwise.
Each turn, the player whose turn it is plays a card that matches the top card of the discard pile in color or face.
Alternatively, a wild card may be played. This allows the player to choose the color of the discard pile.
If a player cannot or does not want to play a matching card, they may draw 1 card and then either play a card or pass their turn.
If a skip card is played, the next player in line skips their turn.
If a reverse card is played, play order reverses.
If a draw 2 card is played, the next player in line skips their turn and draws 2 cards.
If a wild draw 4 card was played, then the next player in line skips their turn and draws 4 cards. The player who played the card can also choose the color of the deck.
A player is only allowed to play a wild draw 4 card if it is the only playable card in their hand.
The player on the other end of the wild draw 4 is allowed to challenge the wild draw 4 play. If this player challenges, the player who played the card must show their hand. If the play was not legal, the player who played the wild draw 4 draws 4 instead. If the play was legal, the player who challenged draws 6.
Before playing your next to last card, you must say Uno. If you don't say Uno and another player catches you with just 1 card before the next player begins their turn, you must pick 4 more cards from the draw pile. If you are not caught before the next player starts their turn, you do not need to draw the cards.
There are 3 accepted versions of scoring.
In match play, scoring does not extend beyond the current round.
The player who plays their last card first wins the round.
In point play, the winner is awarded the outstanding value of the opposing cards left at the end of the round. Face value for numbers, 20 points each for actions, and 50 points each for wild cards. The first to 500 cumulative points wins.
In alternative point play, the value of each player's cards left at the end of the round is added to their own total. As players reach 500 points, they are removed from play until 1 winner is left standing.
Alrighty, and this has been Rules Blitz.
All right, so that was Rules Blitz. Hope you enjoyed it. Now, we're going to, real quick before we get into strategy, if you didn't happen to listen to Rules Blitz, we're going to remind you of the 3 different forms of gameplay, the regular match play, the point play, and the, quote, alternative point play. So we're going to go through all of those different versions, but first we're going to talk about some basic strategies that are kind of tried and true, should work no matter what version of the game you're playing. So the first one I have here is simply pay attention to the cards you have and pay attention to the cards that have been played. So if you're wondering, does this mean counting cards? I would say actually yes, to an extent. So when it comes to knowing exactly how many cards of each number and color have been played, by each player. Obviously, that's a lot to keep track of, but it can be easier to think of, okay, about 5 or 6 greens have been played and 7 or 8 yellows, or even you might be able to have the number exactly down. So basically, count cards as much as you can, because the number of colors that have been played and the number of cards left in the game that can be of a certain color is going to be important, especially as we get to the end game.
Yeah, and I think people might seem a little daunted by hearing the term counting cards. In this case, it's a pretty simple version. All you need to do is keep a tally. You're basically just keeping a tally of the colors. You don't even need to keep track of really much else. It's just red, green, blue, and yellow. And it can be as simple as just having an idea in your head of, a lot of reds were played earlier, but then a lot of yellows were played, and so then not as many blues and greens have been played. It doesn't really need to be exact, but that's sort of, you just kind of want to keep track. It's kind of nice also because Uno will tend to, it lends itself to having long streaks of a certain color, because it's a bit more difficult to change the color of the discard pile as opposed to just changing the number or the face showing on the discard pile, because it's really easy to play something of the same color, harder to play something of the same face. So yeah, and so I think basically the idea is you want to kind of keep track of what's been played and also keep track of what you have. For example, if a lot of red cards have been played, but you have a lot of red cards still in your hand, it might actually make sense for you to try and play out those red cards, because since a lot of them have already been played, other people will probably have less of them by comparison. So then you're more likely to make other players draw if you play your red card. So that's one example of when counting cards will be helpful to informing your decisions in the game.
Right, definitely. And I think that leads nicely into the next concept, which is color and or number diversification, and using it to sort of ensure that you can play. Now, I know this is a pretty contested subject, at least on the online forums we were reading, but so diversification, if you remember from our episode on backgammon, is essentially making it so that if you have to do one thing each round, right? And so if you have 3 or 4 things in your hand that you could possibly play, then that's nice. It gives you a nice secure way to go forward. Whereas if you only have, say, one color in your hand, then unless that color is played, or you get lucky some other reason, like you match a number or whatever, you won't be able to go forward. So the idea of diversification is just sort of ensuring that each time your turn comes around, you'll be able to play a card. Now, where this gets tricky is when we get to late in the game. So if you have a very diverse hand late in the game, let's say you have a green, a blue, and a yellow, how likely are you to actually be able to play that hand out and win the game? So, John, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts here.
Yeah, and I think for now, I think the concept mainly that makes it harder for you to play out a lot of colors from your hand is the fact that it is harder to switch colors than it is to switch numbers. Kind of the same thing I was saying before. So basically, if you have one of each color in your hand, and then say the discard pile is yellow, and you play a yellow, well, the most likely color that the pile will be when it comes back around to you is yellow, and then you won't have a card to play. So in that case, it would have benefited you to have 2 yellows and then maybe a couple other colors. So in some cases, diversification can actually help you play on this turn, but it can almost make it more difficult for you to play on the next turn. So that's why it's a bit controversial. It's not quite clear to either of us. I think we're planning on discussing it a bit, whether you're more likely to win a game with a very diverse hand or a very non-diverse hand, so like all of the same color hand. I think it can go either way with all the randomness, but one might be a little better than the other. We're not quite sure.
Yeah, so I think we will get into that later. The next basic strategy that I have here is use your actions against winning opponents. So basically, your skips, your reverses, your draw twos, they are sort of weapons in your hand, and so if you can use them to sort of attack somebody, if you will, you would probably rather attack somebody who's winning than a person who's got 10 cards in their hand, and you just it might be kind of fun to give them 14 cards when they already have 10, but it doesn't really further your winning prospects. So the idea basically is use these cards to hurt the people that are threatening you. Now, which version of the game you're playing will sort of dictate who is a threat and who is not necessarily a threat. And again, we'll get more into that later, but this is the general point. Use your actions against your winning opponents. Anything to add there, John?
Well, yeah, I think just to kind of think about who is winning, as a general rule, it's going to be the people with less cards in their hand. So that is, again, another thing you got to keep track of if you want to play, sort of optimal Uno, is you got to keep track of who has what in their hand. And usually other players will do a good job of making sure that who's about to win. I think a lot of times people will, or first of all, you'll just hear people saying Uno when they only have one card in their hand. But even when someone's getting down to 2 or 3 cards in hand, other players tend to notice and say something to make sure that everybody knows to target those players with attacks if they can. So I think, yeah, and again, it's basically people aren't as much of a threat to you if they have a ton of cards in hand. But if they have only a few cards in hand, you got to watch out for them.
Right. Got it. Okay. So then the next and final point I have for basic strategies is hold wilds as late as you can. Now, I think we have a couple talking points here. So one is simply how late is that? And then the second, I think, is this true for both wilds and wild draw 4s, or is it just true for wilds? So I don't know if we wanted to get more into this now or if we wanted to talk about it more later in the program when we get to advanced strategies. But simply put, wilds are very powerful, and they let you choose the color, and you can sort of play no matter what. So, I mean, playing no matter what, I think, is almost secondary to being able to choose the color. Because if you've been counting your cards and you know which colors are likely to be had by other players, you can really sort of stick it to the other players if you can play a wild at the right moment. So that's the idea behind why you want to hold them late. When it comes to match play versus point play, you might have different incentives about when you want to get rid of them. But in general, I think the point to be taken away is wilds are very powerful, and you shouldn't just sort of play them willy-nilly, or again, like don't just play them to sort of give somebody else who only has blues, get them from 10 to 14 cards because they have to keep drawing because they can't play anything. Use them strategically, hold them late, so that you can really gain from them.
Well, and I think actually the fact that you can play wild cards at any time, well, not a wild draw 4, but a regular wild card anytime, really we should be careful not to understate that, because I think it can be very useful if you can manage to set up a wild card as one of your last 2 cards or even your last 3 cards, because then, for example, you can just keep sort of fishing around until you can get rid of your last 2, and then if your last card is a wild card, then you just win unless you get attacked in some way. And I think it's essentially in that way, it almost doesn't take up a slot in your hand, because you don't have to worry about when you can play it. So I think that's very powerful, and it's one of the few ways to consistently win a game. Of course, you can always get hit with a draw 4 or a skip or something like that. But yeah, and also I'd like to mention, like, normally I think you talked about whether you should hold your wild draw 4s, but again, you can't play those unless it's your only available move, unless you want to bluff. And so I think basically, based on what we've said about regular wild cards, I think it sort of follows that you probably don't want to bluff to play a wild draw 4 early in the game or when you have a lot of cards. They're kind of the same thing. You'd rather hold it until you basically have no other option to use it in most cases. We might touch on a few times where that wouldn't be the case, but and we might even disagree. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see where it goes.
All right, cool. Well, that's all I have for basic strategies. Any more points before we move on to the different forms of play, John?
No, yeah, I guess just to summarize, try and do as best as you can to keep track of what's going on to sort of inform your decisions, and otherwise it's just play cards. I mean, obviously, I think it's sort of fun to make matches and switch the colors willy-nilly, and we'll talk about that later, but as far as basic strategy goes, you really just want to be focused on thinking about what your opponents are going to be most likely to have in their hands, and then also look at your hand and how you can play out your hand in the best way to mess with your opponents.
Cool. All right, so first we're going to talk about match play. So this is probably the simplest version of the game. So we give this the name match play. I think even that is probably too formal a name for how most people play, including us, by the way. So basically, what we mean by match play is just when you finish a round, like that round, the winner of that round sort of wins the round. There's like no more, no less. I mean, maybe you have a version where the first to 20 rounds wins, which is effectively, qualitatively similar to this, but simply put, like the outcome of one round doesn't affect the outcome of another round. It doesn't affect who's like ahead, so to speak. Basically, all of your decisions should be made with respect to how it helps you win this round.
Yeah, like you can't win a round more in this version, whereas in later versions, when you're counting points, you'll see that you can win a round in a blowout, and it'll actually help you win the match as a whole. But in this case, each round, like you said, is just independent, and you're really just focusing on getting down to 0 cards at all costs. Doesn't matter. You don't have to think about what could be in your hand when someone else wins the game, which is kind of what you're going to have to consider in the later versions. So this is why I think that in match play specifically, you want to be careful to do sort of like micromanage the diversity of your hand. So like, for example, if you want to keep track of both your color diversity, like how many colors you have, but you also want to keep track of your number diversity. So for example, if you have, a red 9 and a red 7, and then you have a yellow 7, and then the color is red, the color discard pile is red, it might behoove you to play the red 7 instead of the red 9, because then you're left with both a 7 and a 9 in your hand, which is going to allow you to play more often than if you have 2 7s in your hand. So that's just another, like a slight change, and in later versions you'll see that you probably just want to play the higher valued card, because that comes with its own benefits. But here in match play, I think you really just want to prioritize losing all your cards as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, I think later on we'll see you do have an incentive to play your higher valued cards first in the other versions, but here in match play, it literally doesn't matter. It's all or nothing. So there's, other things being equal, there's no reason you'd want to play a 9 instead of a 7. if you could play both, you just play the one that gives you the best chance of being able to continue to play and get closer to winning this round.
Mm-hmm. And similarly, you don't really necessarily care about who has been winning the previous rounds. You just want to do whatever's best for you to win this round. So say like you have a friend who's just been going off and they've won the last 3 rounds, and this round they're not looking like much of a threat, but you have another friend who hasn't won yet, but their hand's pretty small. Basically, there's no reason not to target the player who's closest to winning right now. You don't need to think about what's happened in the previous games unless you just want to be vindictive, which
right.
can definitely happen.
Which is, part of what makes it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think to be fair, one of the examples I gave of, playing the first to 20 games, maybe if the leader of the current round is not, very, very behind in the overall match count, and another person who's ahead in the match count is like in second place, maybe you target that person. But, in general, I think if you're not keeping score of how many matches, then, you just want to target whoever's leading the round.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, I guess, and that's another reason there's no reason not to hold the action cards, I guess, right? So if you have a reverse or if you have a skip that you can potentially use to stop someone who's in the lead, later in the game, there's no reason to play those cards if you don't have to. It doesn't really matter if you're stuck with those cards at the end of the game, because you ideally just will win the round and have 0 cards in your hand at the end of the game.
Because at the end of the round, it all goes back in the box.
It all goes back in the box. Thank you, Pastor Dave.
Oh, yeah. So, and actually, it just goes back into the pile. But you know what we mean.
Right.
So, I think we've covered match play. Again, it's this probably the simplest version. So I think we can move on to point play now.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I don't think either of us was super aware that this type of play existed before we started researching.
Which is interesting because apparently it's the most common.
Right. Yeah. So what's interesting about point play is that it does matter what you have in your hand at the end of the game, because at the end of the round, because all of your cards, the value of all your cards, and everybody who lost their cards goes to the winner, and you'll play to a point total like 500. 500, I think, is the official version. You can pick any number. And the first person to 500 wins. And some of the point values of these cards, I mean, the numbers are face value, but, the actions are 20, and the wild cards are 50. So that is, a tenth of the way to victory. So you really want to be mindful of not ending the game with a wild, right? Actions too, but like a little less costly. So, this is where you get into, all other things being equal. If I can play a 7 or a 9, I'll probably play a 9 because that will leave my opponent who wins with fewer points after they win. With wilds, I mean, one of our general principles was hold wilds as late as possible. So now's sort of when we start thinking about like how late is too late. Is there any point where you should start thinking about offloading your wilds, sort of, even though it might not be a quote optimal time to play them?
Well, I would say as long as you only have one wild, it only takes one turn to play out that wild, right? So I would say if you have people that are really close to winning, for example, they literally only have 1 card left or 2 cards left, then you think about playing the wild just because. But just kind of, I guess, think about whether you're going to get another turn. So if you don't play the wild this turn, are you likely to get another turn before the game ends? And if you are, you can save the wild. Because I still think it's pretty most of the time you'll get another turn. If someone has 2 cards in their, or if no one has 1 card in their hand, then you're pretty much guaranteed to get another turn, I believe. I don't think there's any way to play 2 cards from your hand,
I suppose
right?
you're right.
Unless someone skips you.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing you got to worry about. But I feel like that's sort of not worth worrying about. If you're not going to be winning the game anyway, then I think people won't necessarily have an incentive to skip you. So, I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So and of course, sometimes a skip is the only card you can play.
Right.
So you should think about that too. But yeah, broadly speaking, they shouldn't be targeting you if somebody else over here has 1 card left or 2 cards left, and you have much more than that. So I think so with a wild, if your opponent, let's say you have 2 wilds and your opponent has 2 cards left, are you playing one of these 2 wilds this next turn?
I would say probably.
Okay.
You don't need to. I mean, I could definitely see it paying off not doing that. If you have the option not to, it's still quite unlikely. Just that if your opponent has 2 cards that they're going to finish out in 2 rounds, it's definitely possible. So I don't know. What do you think the risk reward is worth it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost you're almost less better off playing a wild in that scenario. I feel like, because I don't know, I think they're less likely to go out in the next 2 turns with 2 cards than they are on the next 1 turn with 1 card. What
Definitely.
do you think about this probabilistically?
I would say
that's true,
gotta
right?
be true.
Yeah.
Also, one thing is that if you have the wild card, you can dictate the color, right? So if they do get down to 1 card, you can play the wild card and dictate the color to something that you think they don't have. So you actually probably can force them to not go out in 2 turns. So I think there's like a solid case to be made for not playing a wild card if you have 2 wild cards and your opponent has, and the first place opponent has 2 cards in their hand.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth pointing out that if you've got those 2 wilds, early in the game, and you can't play any of your number cards. Actually, we'll get into reneging later. I keep getting to it, but we'll save that juicy stuff for the end. Okay, so so basically, to summarize, you're trying to, because your outcomes are cumulative, you need to maximize your chances of winning the overall game. So if you're ahead in the round, this should mean winning the round, no? So if you are in first place this round, do you sort of move from, being conscious of the point values of your cards to this sort of match play mentality of, I'm doing whatever it takes to win the round. So, I'll play a 4 instead of a 9 because, I think there are more 9s left, or I'll stuff like that. Maybe that's a bad example, or I'll hold my action cards to be held against the next best player, even though they're harder to play.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a case to be made for that. So just playing, I guess you consider that playing aggressively, right? Aggressively, holding your strong cards for the end is actually an aggressive play because you're not planning on losing, essentially.
Right.
And so I think that's generally like a good thing unless you're neck and neck with someone. If you're pretty much even with someone, but you two are way ahead of the rest of the pack, then you might consider still playing somewhat cautiously.
Okay, wait, sorry. Can you run that back?
So, like, if you have a lot of action cards, if you have an action card that you can play, or you can play a number card, and it would put you at 2 cards, and you also have an opponent that's at 2 cards, but the rest of the people have like 5 or 6 cards in their hand, right? Then you might think about playing the action because it's not really clear if you're ahead in that situation.
Okay.
Like basically if you're ahead of most of the people, but there's someone else who's somewhat close to you, then I would say it'd still be a little bit cautious about how many points you're keeping in your hand.
Okay, because you might end up losing the round.
Yeah, because you can very easily lose a round even if you get down to one card, right?
Right, definitely.
So then your odds of winning, even if you look like you're ahead, are not that high.
Okay.
Is my understanding of the randomness of the game. It every time you kind of make a run down to one or two cards, it's still not that likely that you win.
Okay.
So yeah.
So you don't want that one card to be like, a skip or a reverse.
Even though that's probably okay,
Yeah.
but I don't know.
I mean, I guess like because your points are, everyone's points are being awarded to the winner, and it's not like your points are directly counting negatively against you. It's if unless your points go to the person who is ahead in the total point count, you're not losing that much, I feel like. So like,
yeah, so that's when it comes to keeping track of who's ahead in the entire game, right?
Right.
And that's another thing that we were going to talk about is like you need to not only think about who's looking like they're going to win this round, but you also need to think about who's winning the game. Because, I mean, yeah, the points in point play, points only go to the person who wins the round.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, so you need to like think about how many points that person already has if they look like they're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not even sure that it changes too much because I feel like you still just attack whoever's going to win the round, whoever you think is going to win the round. And like you said, maybe if the person who has the most points total is looking like they're in like a close second place for this round, you might attack them.
Right.
But most of the time, like unless that's the case, you probably just attack whoever's winning the round.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that makes sense because, again, your points go to the winner of the round. So if, unless the point leader is winning the round or might win the round, you don't really care about attacking them. If they end up with more cards at the end because you attacked them, it's not a negative to them. It's just a positive to whoever won the round. So it's not really, it's not really the vindictive idea of like I'm cutting down the person who's in front. So like, yeah, that makes sense. You really should only be concerned if it looks like they might win.
Yeah, and I think you don't. We also keep saying like the player in the lead, but also if there's players that are close behind, you need to watch out for them too.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, any player that's going to be threatening to take a big lead if they win another round, right? So, yeah, you really have to throw in the context of what's happened in the previous rounds into your decisions for this game and who to try and attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So then I think, yeah. Okay. One more topic I wanted to get in here before we move on to the alternative point play is if you're sufficiently behind, do you shift your focus toward like offloading your high value cards? Let's say everybody has 2 or 3 and you have 8 or 9 cards. Do you shift your focus from like, holding wilds late so they'll be useful to, gosh, I can't end up with a wild or a skip or a reverse. I don't want to give the winner all these points and I'm not going to win anyway. So, I'm sort of not going to worry about playing these strategically. I'm just going to play them when I can play them. Do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's got to be the smart move. If your odds of winning a round are, again, we're gonna say sufficiently low, and this could be any sort of cutoff, and it's really hard to like calculate what this cutoff is. But in the example that you said, where you're clearly behind, you have 7 or 8 cards, and everyone else and multiple people have only 2 cards or less. I think it has to be better for you in the long run if you just play all of your highest valued cards. Because, and I think that in that case it's really obvious, but even in other cases where, you have 5 or 6 cards, other people have one or two, like two players have two cards, you have 5 or 6, and then a couple players are in the middle at like 3 or 4 cards. Even then, I think that's when the question comes into play. Like, how far behind do you have to be to try and offload points? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it were me playing, which again, I don't think we're gonna get to a robust right answer here. But listeners, if you want to email us with what you think, that would be great. Details after the show. But if it were me, I would probably say if I'm like 2 to 3 cards behind, then I'm starting to think about offloading for offloading's sake. And maybe that's too close, but I just like if you win a round and it's worth 50 points versus you win a round and it's worth 100 points, that's just a really big difference. And so if you have 2 or 3 action cards, like that's basically the difference we're talking about in terms of what you might be able to offload before the victory is had. So, like it's cool to play spoiler, and to make victory more difficult for your opponent when it's not in sight for you. And I don't know what it says about me that it seems like I'm giving up relatively soon by saying 2 or 3 cards behind, but I think I like to be conservative when it comes to that sort of strategy. I don't know. What do you think, John?
I think probably 3 cards is when I think about doing it, and especially if I have multiple action cards. I mean, because each action card, that's 20 points. Especially if I have multiple wilds, which are 50. Like, I feel like I'm definitely playing a wild if I'm 3 cards behind, and the person I'm behind has 1 or 2 cards.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't really worry too much if a person has 3 or more cards, because I feel like because if you think about it, like, we're saying like 2 or 3 cards behind. That's like a really relative difference, because if you have,
if it's 7 versus 10, like, it's not a big deal.
Exactly, that's like you're not that far behind. But if it's 2 cards versus 5 or 1 card versus 4, especially, then it's like I feel like you need to like start losing some points, especially if you have multiple action cards or multiple wilds in your hand.
Mm-hmm.
If you only have one of them, you might be more conservative. You might wait till you're even a little further behind. If you think that like eventually that action card can help you, like attack another player.
Mm-hmm.
But it's all a bit risky. So
yeah, definitely. And again, no clear-cut answers, but just it's also just about asking the right questions, and that's why we're here. So do you think we're ready to move on to alternative point play?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, cool. So this form is interesting. From what we've read, it's not as popular, but I think there's a cool suspense element in it. So basically, you have your point total that everyone's playing to, just like in the regular point play version, but instead of everyone's points going to the winner of the round, your points that you have left at the end of the round count negatively toward you. So if you had a skip and a reverse, you'd have 40 points at the end of the round, and obviously the winner would get 0 points. And if you cross that threshold of 500 points or maybe 200 points or whatever you choose, then you're out. You can't play any more rounds, and it's kind of last person standing wins. So I kind of like this because I like the idea of one by one they're picked off, and then finally you have a match between 2 players, and the last one standing wins. There's a lot of suspense in that gameplay, which is why I think it's fun. And then a lot of the strategy, you would think 2 point plays, they're going to be pretty similar, but I think a lot of the strategies are different or even opposite in alternative point play. So anything to add, John, before we get into specific strategies?
No, well, yeah, I think actually it's interesting that you mentioned suspense, because I think probably the reason why this form of play, why I would guess it isn't as popular, is because it probably leads to a lot of downtime for most of the players.
Right.
For example, if you get knocked out early, you're watching people play Uno for another hour, which can be probably not how I want to spend my day usually, my normal day.
I guess that's fair.
So I think that that can be that's an interesting thing with formats such as this, that people, when you sort of knock people out of the game early, it can be not as fun. But that said, I think it can be very nice if you're one of those people that gets to keep playing.
Yeah.
And if you follow maybe what we're talking about, hopefully you'll have a higher chance of staying in the game longer.
Yeah, and I think the bragging rights at the end are probably heightened here as well compared with the other forms of play.
I mean, you've basically won a tournament almost.
Yeah, it's a tournament. Yeah, okay. So basically, the reason why strategy here is different is because your points count negatively toward you. So, in a sense, you actually don't care as much about who wins the round. Of course, it's nice to win the round, but if you play 10 rounds and each of those rounds, you only have 5 points left in your hand when you lose, and your opponent, plays these 10 rounds and wins half of them, but on the ones they don't win, they have 50, well, then you're looking great.
Right, yeah. I think the funny thing is just that, you can lose every round except essentially and get to the last two players. But yeah, probably phrase that
tit for tat strategy.
Yeah, and I think that the key thing to think about is okay, winning a round technically is the best way to minimize the amount of points that you earn, because you want to get as few points as possible. So obviously you're going to aim to get 0 points in every round. However, getting 5 points in a round is essentially, it's almost negligible. Even getting up to 10 points is just not that bad compared to someone who has 3 or 4 cards in their hand and they're taking a 35 point loss. That's several rounds of points right there. So I think this type of play sort of lends itself to really making sure you offload your expensive cards. So I think it's kind of like what we were just talking about 2 or 3 cards behind, you think about it. I think you start thinking about that stuff even earlier, right? I mean, that would be my guess. So what do you think, Dan?
Well, I mean, if obviously I don't start thinking about it at the start of the game, because, you want to preserve your own flexibility. You want to be able to attack people, I guess so the game goes on longer and you have more of a chance to offload cards. So, I'm kind of thinking about, it's almost similar to match play, although I might be wrong on this, in terms of if somebody's about to win, you want to, I don't know, maybe if people are down to about 3 cards, I start offloading my valuable ones. Can't give you a strong reasoning why, honestly. It seems so, like I said, almost opposite to the other way of thinking.
I mean, I think it's very similar to the original point play, just way more incentive to offload expensive cards. So yeah, I think you think about that more often. And also you don't really care who wins each round nearly as much. So I think also playing, this is one format where you would actually be heavily incentivized to play a wild draw 4 or a draw 2 against a player who's ahead in the total game, even if they're wildly behind in a round.
Yes.
Right? So because giving someone more cards if the game is about to end is literally going to just take away points from them, or it's going to give them points which they don't want. So you actually have way more of an incentive to like attack people that aren't winning the round.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, so this is kind of where you get to you really don't care. With the original point play, you only were interested in attacking someone if they were about to win the round. Here, like, if they have like 0 points total and everyone else has around, I don't know, 100, but they have like 10 cards in their hand, you might still want to attack them, and give them some more cards. I don't know, maybe that example is a bit extreme, but the principle is, even if somebody has no way to win the round, if they're ahead in the total or have the lowest total, you are still interested in sticking it to them.
Yeah, I think that's probably that's actually one of the more interesting parts now that I think about it. Yeah, just that and the fact that you actually don't really care who wins the round. You can kind of play it cool when your friends probably they eventually come to brag to you about how many rounds they've won, and you say, well, we're only like 10 points different in score, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that's about it. Do you have anything else to add for alternative point play?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of how the strategy differs. And I know we wanted to get to some more juicy concepts as well. Talking about the end games, talking about switching colors, even talking about some bluffing. This isn't poker, it's Uno. But so one of the things we mentioned in our rules blitz is you are allowed to play a wild draw 4 only if it's your only possible move. However, that doesn't stop you from playing a wild draw 4, even if you have other moves available. So the person that you attacked with the wild draw 4 can challenge you, and if you were wrong to play that card, then you have to draw 4 instead of them. And if it turns out that you played it correctly, you played it legally, then they have to draw 6 because they were wrong on the challenge. So we're talking about large amounts of cards here. And I'm trying to think if it's even ever worth challenging someone. And of course, you and I have talked about this. I think we're really bad at bluffing anyway. And so if you're interested in learning how to bluff well, we definitely won't be able to tell you that. But maybe we could talk through like sort of a really quick, when would you consider bluffing or challenging, or is it ever worth it?
I think, like when I would consider bluffing has to just be when it's to stop someone who's about to, like, to stop your opponent next to you who's about to win the game, or sorry, the round. Well, even the game would be a better reason, but if they're about to win a round and you have, I think also one thing to think about is that bluffing that you can't play any other cards works better when you have less cards in your hand. So right. If you only have 3 cards in your hand, playing a wild draw 4 is probably like going to be pretty hard to call someone out on.
Right.
So you might have more incentive to do that when the opponent next to you has 1 card left. Now, again, like if you're, on the other hand, someone's trying to play a wild draw 4 on you, then you only have 1 card, then you should probably look at them and say, okay, look at how many cards they have.
If they have 11 cards.
Yeah, it's like if they have a lot of cards, then you can look at it and say, okay, they're probably bluffing just to give themselves some sort of chance. And in that case, I feel like calling it would be smart because if you're wrong, you only draw 2 more cards. Like if you're taking a draw 4, you're just going to be in bad shape regardless. So I feel like adding 2 extra cards to the 4 that you're going to draw is not the biggest punishment if you think that you're somewhat likely to actually win the call out.
Right. Now, does this change if, say, so obviously, like if you have Uno and like the person after you also called Uno, for example, then I feel like you're pretty much challenging no matter what, because you will maybe lose if you do draw these 4 cards. Let's say if everyone else has about, maybe 3 or 4 cards, is, the person in second place, do you risk challenging and drawing those more cards, where if you had to draw the 4 cards, you may still be in it?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and I think I probably wouldn't challenge at that point. I mean, of course, again, it always depends on how many cards the player who played the draw 4 has.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, that's probably the biggest thing.
If they have, like, even if they're playing a draw 4 out of a 5 card hand, like, I probably wouldn't challenge that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that might be somewhat of a bait. Like, they might be baiting you to challenge or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, you can't really. I don't know. It's kind of hard to do that.
Yeah, you can't really bait with a wild draw 4.
Yeah, because when you would be quote unquote baiting, you would have no choice but to play the card. Yeah. So maybe that's a bad example, but yeah, I think it varies. You got to think about. There's so much to think about, because one, if you're just playing match play, then you definitely just want to do whatever's gonna maximize your chance to win the round. So like you said, if there's someone right next to you that has Uno, you probably call out the person who played the draw 4 on you, because otherwise you're just very likely to lose.
Mm-hmm.
But in point play, the penalty can be a lot bigger for getting more cards.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Yeah, and I think with point play, you take into consideration the other things we've talked about, like who's ahead. Is this person going to, are they close to winning the whole game? Like, are they in the, if you're alternative, are they like lower than everyone else? And with alternative, you would think of your own point total. Like, are you close to being knocked out? Could these 2 cards like maybe knock you out or set you back a lot? Yeah. But I think that those are the things you want to think about. And now I think we also wanted to talk about wilds and reneging.
Yeah, so Dan kept texting me about reneging, and I had just absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Apparently, this is the term to describe exactly this situation where you have a wild card in your hand, and you, I believe this is the definition. You have a wild card in your hand, and you pass the turn and take a card just so that you don't get rid of the wild card from your hand. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Where'd you get that term?
I think it's from one of our sources.
All right.
Yeah. The How Stuff Works one, I believe.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so the idea is, this wild is just such a good card to have. And, if you draw a new card, you have about, again, depending on what's been played, you have about a third chance of pulling something playable. So 24 of a color, 7 others of the number, and 7 wilds other than, what you have in your hand. And all that's over 108. So you get roughly a third. And so again, it's going to change with what's been played. But you have a decent chance of pulling something playable. And, maybe the idea is maybe sometimes that chance is going to be sufficient in your mind for the ability to hold on to this wild until a time when you think it will be optimal to play it.
Yeah, and I think, and one thing that you brought up when you just talked about bluffing is that when you said the word bluffing, it also brought up the fact that if you purposely pass when you have a wild card, then probably people might think you have a worse hand than you do.
True.
So they might assume, they might assume things about your hand that they really shouldn't assume, because actually one of your cards was good and it's a wild card. They might think, for example, that you can't play if the pile is red and you pull on a red, they're probably going to assume that you can't play on reds. Other players will do that, so they might try to keep the pile on reds as if that's going to hurt you, but it won't. So, you can kind of use it to mess with your opponents and what they think your hand looks like.
Okay.
But then again, I think that's also, there's a flip side of that, is that you need to be thinking about that whenever someone else takes a card too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of something that just makes the game a lot more complicated. I didn't even know that you were again. I didn't know you were allowed to do this before we started our research. I thought that it was just poor play, or you're not paying attention to your cards or whatever. But there is a real strategic element of potentially not playing a card even when you can. And so I think my follow-up would be: would you ever consider drawing instead of playing a wild draw 4?
Oh, that's a great question.
It seems inherently more risky
Why would that be?
because a wild you can get rid of at any time.
Oh, I see.
A wild draw 4 you really can't.
So
And
for
I guess
point play,
for point play, if you're really behind, then maybe it's not such a smart move.
or even if you're mildly behind.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, okay, I can see that then. If it's just match play, then I feel like wild draw 4 is technically, it's like almost as good as a wild card in getting you down to 0 cards,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you have a little bit less freedom, so it's going to be inherently like a little worse, but it's not that much worse than just having a wild card as far as sort of deleting your hand size. But yeah, in point play, I think, again, you just have to start considering what the possible negative side effects of not playing this card would be. So, yeah, I mean, I think you could probably just gonna have to reason based on the situation of the game and the principles we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So now I think lastly we're gonna talk about what you've been waiting for, and this is
I have
the huge question of whether to switch colors in a certain endgame scenario. And maybe you want to be the one to lay this out, John?
Yeah, so first I'll just say that we're going to assume that you've matched the face of the discard pile with a face in your hand. So assume that you have the ability to change the color of the discard pile, just so I don't sound like I'm talking gibberish. The question is essentially like, what do you gain? When should you switch the color if you have the opportunity to switch it or keep it the same? And when should you switch the color? When should you not switch the color? Now, I think we all come up to this and we all kind of think, oh, like if we can match a number, we might as, that seems like fun. And so it comes up less often. So you might play the number match just because it's sort of fun and satisfying.
Yeah. Kind of throws everyone for a loop.
Yeah. And exactly. Changing the color can throw everyone for a loop. But I think other things to consider is this is where like counting cards comes into play a ton, because you need to think about what cards have been played in large numbers. So like what color is everyone least likely to have? And then also think about what colors you have in your hand. So like the example I was thinking of is that, say the discard pile shows red, and you have 3 red cards and 4 green cards, but you match a green face to the red card. So you can either play your green card and then go down to 3 green cards in hand and 3 red cards in hand, or you can play a red card on top of the red, and then you have 2 reds and 4 greens on top, or in your hand. So then the question is, do you switch or do you not switch? My interpretation or my thoughts have been that it really does depend on what was most recently played. For example, if the stack's been red for a long time, then you might sort of assume that other players are getting depleted of all the red cards in hand. So you might actually want to keep it on the red. Whereas if the color was just switched to red and then you have the chance to switch it again, that might actually be quite useful. So what do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I think if more reds have been played than greens, then something else to think about is if you switch it to green, then it might be hard to get rid of the rest of your reds later, because it might be less likely that the pile is going to switch to red if most of the reds have already been played. So you might want to get rid of your reds while you still can.
Yeah. Because I mean, on any given turn, I feel like the pile is more likely to stay the same color than it is to switch.
Right.
And so, if you're trying to like get rid of cards from your hand, I feel like you can almost sort of plan on the pile staying the same color, because if it switches, you have like no control over what it switches to,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just a random chance at that point. But you can control what the pile looks like when, like, after your turn, right? That's basically all you can control.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I'm trying to think of something besides, what's in your hand and what has been played that would sort of also dictate whether you wanted to switch or not.
I mean, well, I guess you can think of what the players in the lead have been playing too, specifically them as opposed to the other players. But I'm not. That seems a lot harder to keep track of, personally.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Yeah, it's usually further than I go when I play.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, if you're at a party, maybe you've had a few drinks, maybe you're not exactly able to.
Maybe you're
keep
not in
track
tip-top
of
shape. Yeah.
all the colors that everyone has played. So, but. I mean, so I think maybe we should get into. Do we want to talk about like, extend it to the 2-card variety at the end?
Yeah, I think because this is that's a general case, and that's a case for like in the middle of the game. But I think the most important time to consider this is like when a player has gone to Uno, and you have the chance to switch colors, and should you switch colors, right? I feel like that's what's most impactful about this sort of discussion. So yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, and I can go ahead too.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's imagine the same situation. The player, say the player to your right, puts down a red card and calls Uno, and you have a red card and then a green card that matches face. Do you switch or do you stay red? Now I think Dan has done sort of the mathing out of this, and so if you assume that you don't really know, if you assume that things are kind of just happening randomly, the deck's evenly distributed, there's equal number of each color, which of course we'll know how many cards of each color are in the deck still by that time in the game. But imagine they're all even, then basically if you don't switch, there's a 25% chance that the player will have that same color when it comes back around to them.
Right.
But if you do switch, when Dan did the math out, it's still 25% chance that whatever color you switch to, the opponent will have in their hand.
Right.
But this is not taking into account anything as far as strategy or previous knowledge of cards played, right? So I feel like that's
right.
got to skew what you do.
Yeah, I mean, so like you said, you switch to red, you switch to green, or you stay on red. Like if most of the red cards have been played, then it's probable that last card in your opponent's head is not a red. I guess more probable than the baseline. So you probably want to stay on red. If not a lot of red cards have been played, or maybe a lot of green cards have been played, so you switch it to green, or maybe you don't. It's like maybe not a lot of cards of green have been played, but fewer red cards have been played. I mean, like you said, you don't have the option to switch to green to blue or yellow. So even if you might want to, maybe those have been most played. You just, I think you go with the one that's just less likely to be out there. So the one that's been played the most.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think the only other thing that can really, I agree with you there, that as a baseline, when you consider all this information that you have about what cards have been played, then you can decide what color is most likely to be in their hand. But I think this also doesn't account for human for the strategy element of the game. So I was wondering, like, for example, will a player be more likely to try and get will a good player be more likely to try and get their last two cards to be of the same color or of different colors? And now I think personally that it would be better for a player, like if you're trying to exit, if you're trying to like get rid of all your cards, I think you'd rather have two reds than a red and a green in your hand.
Right.
Because if you can play the one red, then it's more likely, by the time the turn comes around to you, as long as the color didn't switch, you win. If you play a green, if you have a red and a green and you play a red, call Uno, then you have to get lucky. The color has to switch, and it has to switch to the correct color that you have. So that's like pretty unlikely, I feel like. So as a player, I think it actually would be nice to try and get down to two cards of the same color. I mean, ideally you have one card of one color and then a wild card or stuff like that. But, like two greens, I feel like is going to get you out of the game faster than a red and a green.
Yeah. And I think there's also, going off again on the idea that the color doesn't change relatively often. So if you start out with a pretty evenly spaced hand, 2, 2, 2, and 1 maybe, it's likely that you're going to play one of your colors first, and then the color's going to change, and you're going to play another of your colors, and then the color's going to change, whatever. And then it's probably more likely that your last two cards are going to be the same color than that they're going to be split. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I would think so, right? Because
at least more likely than random chance, right?
Yeah, it should be slightly more likely that that you don't end up with even hands. I feel like, yeah, that makes sense, right? Your hands can go, when you're drawing cards, your hands tend to be sort of somewhat evenly distributed. Of course, there's still randomness involved, and then as you play, your hand's most likely going to get filtered out of individual colors, and then you'll have a less even hand as you go down in cards. So I think that definitely makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. So that might make you more likely to actually want to switch the color if you can. You still absolutely 100% need to consider what's been played. Like, again, I would maybe argue that's the biggest issue that you need to consider. But yeah, you should also keep in mind that, like, naturally this game, because it doesn't switch colors very often, is going to lend itself to sort of clusters of cards of the same color being played at a time, and conversely being left in your hand at a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think so. It doesn't switch colors as often as it stays the same color. Definitely, because you could still say it switches colors often, because that's sort of a relative term. But yeah, it definitely is more likely that the pile stays the same color than to say that it changes color.
Right.
I think that's pretty easily arguable. So yeah. So I guess those two things is what you want to consider. And I mean, personally, I would consider them about even. Dan thinks that mostly what matters is what's been played. Again, that's why we're just talking here and we're trying to discuss. So, but I do think that in either case, it's like, given no other information, I would like to switch colors.
Okay.
Because if you switch colors, it's sort of like you sort of bring the percentage back down to 25%. Or you at least like you sort of know the percentage is closer to the base rate of like what is left in the deck.
Okay.
Would be my guess. I think like because people can sort of shape their hands, but if they only have two cards, like, there's nothing saying that they would shape their hand to like a red and a green as opposed to a red and a blue.
Right.
If they think like red's gonna come up often, then they have to like figure out which other card. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like switching is like a safer bet on average than not switching.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. You know, given again, like if everything's been even or roughly even, then yeah, you probably want to switch. And then, maybe you say like if the colors have been very lopsided and you have an opportunity to switch to a color that's been played a lot, maybe that tips the scales. But yeah, probably I would agree with you that the default would be you should switch if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also just the biggest thing to remember is that whatever you do decide, if it works or doesn't work, don't take it to heart.
Exactly.
Because you could definitely make the right move and it still doesn't work out. It's just how it goes.
Exactly. Or you could make a stupid decision and it worked this one time. So
That's what randomness does. So
oh yeah.
and we I think we bring this up almost every episode. So
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that covers what we had. Unless you had any final words.
No. Yeah. I mean, just play out as many cards as you can. I guess that's the game of Uno.
That's the name of the game. Uno is the name of the game. So, yeah, we're going to wrap up then really quick before we go. There was this website that we came across when we were doing our research. It's called unotips.com. It will not really teach you how to play Uno, but it's a fantastically written sort of almost like pseudo-serious comedic account of Uno. It's hard to explain, but you should go there and check it out. It gave us a lot of laughs.
Well, it'll take you through the philosophy of Uno really more than the rules or gameplay.
Definitely.
But it's definitely it's worth a click for sure.
Absolutely. unotips.com. All right. So that's it for the show, and we will see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you. And this has been How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How to Beat Your Kids at Board Games. We hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something. We always do. If you like our show, please tell your friends and be sure to rate or review us wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions for games you'd like us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Please email us at htbykabg@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.